Well, kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for being here, and we really appreciate this opportunity because this is an unusual audience to speak to. We have been in this project mostly speaking to people in the transport sector and engineering sector and urban planning, and people that I normally don't speak to that much, but coming from population health as we do. But I think you are going to keep us sharpened, and we're really, really appreciative of the insights you might have. So I'm talking about a project called Inclusive Streetscapes, which is funded by the Health Research Council of New Zealand, coming to its final stages now. And I'm going to be sharing the space with Mythily here. One thing I should say is I work at Middlemore Hospital some of the time, and when you walk in the door, everybody asks, so have you been unwell? Normally when you have your staff tag, they don't ask, but I have got a cough. I had a bug 10 days ago. Don't worry, carry on. I had to show my COVID test as being negative when I walked into Middlemore yesterday. So just letting you know if I'm coughing.
She can show it to you today.
Yeah, I can. It's on my phone. And if I cough, it's asthma. It's not.
Me too.
Good. That's good. I'm in good company. We can't take anything for granted, knowing what's happening across the Tasman, sadly, at the moment. Anyway, this particular topic is one that's close to my heart, mostly because I started some of my research in epidemiology and road injuries, but I've increasingly got more concerned about actually not injuries, but do people have the opportunities to live the lives they value in getting about the way they would like. And active travel is such a big deal, and we talk about it quite a lot, about time in New Zealand, because it's such a car-dominant country. And these are the sorts of posters around, cycling and walking, and I think the time of COVID, probably one of the nicer things we saw was a lot more cycling and walking. But this particular poster attracted my attention when it first came out from Auckland Transport. It has lovely pictures, colour, people, vibrant, lively, energetic people. But I often keep thinking, because my mum was living with me for about 15 months and realizing how locked in she was because the street we were in was really not very accessible to her. It doesn't necessarily represent the demographic of New Zealand particularly well. And Missy will know these issues from her work in disability, but I think it's often, not that all disabilities are visible, but there's often not very obvious issues that are clear from an inclusive point of view. So apart from that, the other thing that was interesting was around this time, one of my colleagues, Annika Anderson, who's also a medical anthropologist like Mythily, was working on a project at Te Puia Marae, looking at what was making it difficult for the Kaumatua who lived in Te Puia Marae to access primary health care. So she was thinking they're going to come out with a whole lot of issues around how inaccessible and unfriendly health systems can be. And yes, there are difficulties without a doubt in the health system. But one of the things she was struck by was how difficult it was to get to the health system for the Kaumatua who were actually living at Te Puia Marae. So this seeded the idea, which effectively was then a range of geographers. Our geographers just left the room, but anyway, he'll be in good company because quite a few of the people in this team are geographers of various kinds, particularly Janine Wiles, who's a gerontologist and a geographer, and Karen Witten, who some of you might know from Massey University. And actually, you might have come across Karen in your work, I'm not quite sure. Who was doing urban stuff, urban transport stuff. I think they probably know Karen quite well. Anyway, Annika, Esther Welling, Fire Dolly, Fire Julie are all people connected in one form or another to Puia Marae. And they were very involved in developing this with the Kaumatua engaged in the whole process, which is why Fire Julie and Fire Dolly are there. And a Pacific team led by Malakai Ofanoa, who's a senior lecturer in our school, and then a range of others. Julie Spray, who's also an anthropologist, and Mythily have been our research fellows. So why this project? Effectively, we were really concerned that older residents and disabled people in Auckland, people differently challenged, let's say, by built environments, may not be very front of mind in the way transport systems are designed and implemented. So we were keen to know, from their perspective, how do these systems and streetscapes influence their health and well-being? How can their perspectives better inform the sort of design processes transport professionals engage in? And how can transport professionals' practices and monitoring processes reflect their lived experiences, that is, the transport professionals' experiences, as well as the communities they're supposedly serving? It's a complex project which has several strands, and we're going to focus on just one. So the most important one, actually, is strand 1, which is actually talking with communities themselves and their lived experience and knowledge. As I mentioned, we were also engaging with transport professionals through a survey and key informant interviews, and I will only summarize final sort of findings in that regard at the end. We're also looking at some of the measures, audits, and indicators transport professionals typically use. But coming to the main issue, which is around what communities we were engaging with in this project, we essentially looked at 4 areas, effectively urban areas and suburban areas in Tamaki Makaurau. So we look at the west, effectively places from New Lynn up towards Ranui Henderson, and that actually was a site led by Malakai. So all the participants, 15 community participants, were all Pacific, so Samoan, Tongan, Tokalawan, Tuvaluan, and from Kiribati. So that whole site was actually Pacific participants. From GI, Gleninus, because we were at the School of Population Health, right, our back door, predominantly Maori and Pacific participants from that area. From Mangere, actually from Te Puia Marae, people living in the Papakainga there and in the environs. And Howick, which is sort of a different suburb, which is sort of half and half, Chinese, Asian, and European. Altogether, we did 62 interviews, which I'll talk very briefly about 15 in each of these sites. And altogether, among those 62, a third were Maori, a third were Pacific ethnicities, and of the remaining third, it was half and half, New Zealand, European, and Chinese, predominantly coming from Hawaii. The interview approach we used was go-along interviews, which is where often we started with an interview at people's homes, but they then often took us along for a walk that might be of value for them. Sometimes they actually couldn't walk out, and then sometimes might be just to the letterbox down their driveway, or sometimes a few couldn't actually walk at all, and that was fine. So we were effectively engaging with people who lived with a disability over older people. Most of them were over 65 or 70. And we used photo voice to supplement the interviews, where the participants themselves would either take photographs or get the research assistants who were with them to take photographs. And we did interactive workshops in these communities, really feeding back the information we gathered to them first, so that we could really understand what their thoughts were on what we had collected and their, in a sense, validation. All the research assistants were from the communities, and they were actually from the same ethnic groups that the participants were from, and spoke 9 different languages, because that was what was needed to actually engage with these communities. I'm going to pass on to Mythily now, because she's going to talk about one particular aspect which comes from a very strong agenda in New Zealand, as you probably know, around well-being. Probably all of you know, the Treasury, all the way down to every other sector, is talking about well-being. So we just want to know what's in this from a well-being point of view from the community. So I'm going to hand over to Mythily.
Shall we swap seats?
Yep, please.
Thanks.
Shanti's a seasoned presenter, but I'll mostly be reading from the notes, but I'll try and be as charismatic as I can. So I guess the sort of the sharp question guiding what I'm going to be presenting today was this question of, well, if transport affects well-being and well-becoming, then we need to understand how this occurs and where the well-being is located, where responsibility for people's well-being is located, and where the policy intervention or possibility of it is located as well. So to start off with, what we did when we went over all our sort of interviews and the walks is we tried to understand what people desire and draw from and the varied aspects of their excursions that made them meaningful to them. I'll go on to talk about the extent to which the opportunities for this kind of joy and what people desire are unevenly distributed. But first, let's chart the ways that people talk about what they drew value of in their surroundings. So firstly, and strikingly, interviewees in every site noted the satisfaction of being able to move about and encounter beautiful sights and how this affected their sense of self. They indicated such pleasures in really offhand remarks while they were walking, the sort of side bits that you kind of think, oh, that's nice, but I don't know what I do with that. Things like Wendy and Glen Innes saying, oh, listen to those birds, aren't they glorious? Or Emily and Mangere saying, take a photo of the trees, oh, the trees are absolutely beautiful. And those are the trees she was talking about. Yuan and Howick on a particularly foggy day said, "Beautiful, oh look, the sun comes out. I think you will get happier after a walk outside." Mario and Glen Innes connected the perception of a lovely scene to a mental experience. He said, "I see the sea view and it stimulates the brain." Mario was in a wheelchair and he was often in a lot of pain, and he noted the importance to him of keeping moving in order to stay hopeful and to stay open to opportunities for social encounters and connections, and how that was a circular contingent process of being attuned to the fact that going out when he was able to, even when in pain, prevented depression. And if he let depression accumulate and let himself not go out, he knew he would stop going out even more. So he was very mindful of that and attuned to it, and tried his best to sort of see the opportunities he could to leave the house and get out in Glen Innes. So the socialities that people desire and which mobility affords them can be planned and incidental, or incidental and hoped for, like Mele out west, who talked about encounters with other electrical wheelchair users, which he said were the happiest time for me. We have coffee, we talk for hours before I come back, just sort of hanging out on the sidewalk. There's a real sense across our interviews of a longing, if not loneliness, that many people lived quietly with most of their time at home, that being able to be mobile mitigates or diminishes the possibility of, even if that is brief. Exercise and being able to pursue it was another source of well-being, and the capacity to move around for fitness or otherwise was, like I said earlier, unevenly distributed. So among Howick participants, the Chinese women in particular seemed quite health conscious. They talked about taking numerous walks up to 3 times a day for exercise, often including the close-by reserves and beaches in their strolls. Pākehā and New Zealand European participants in Howick were perhaps less likely than the Chinese participants to walk regularly. Often this was because of injury, although several expressed an ambition to walk more. Still, the capacity to walk and enjoy their surrounds was also thwarted not only by health conditions that sort of saw the difference between Chinese. I'm so embarrassed, that's actually me. Let me attend to that.
That's your charisma.
Oh,
Check our phones.
I felt like I was going fine until that.
You're doing fine.
Silence. All right. Apologies to the recording, especially. So the health conditions, of course, sort of affect people's ability to go out and exercise and sort of take walks. But as well as that, the surrounds that they were in noticeably sort of affected their ability to take walks. So participants in the West valued exercise and good health or seemingly almost as much as the people in Howick. But the urban build and topography of their suburb posed many challenges to walking. The western suburbs are quite hilly, historically an industrial area, several multi-lane arterial main roads that have been retrofitted to be residential over subsequent years, compared to Howick, that's again out west compared to Howick, which was originally developed as a residential area for retired soldiers and families and remains socioeconomically better off. So many participants in the West struggled with the slopes and described feeling like asthmatic to the knees and saying things like, "I can't catch my breath." Poor quality and obstacles on pavements, sparsely distributed and unsafe road crossings. All of these things challenged their aspirations to enhance well-being through exercise. So for many of those we spoke to, these types of pleasures, of nature, of exercise, of connection, of company and belonging, are shadowed by the possibility of their loss for periods of time, because rain and bodily pain and bouts of illness can all keep people from being out and about. But so do hills and poorly maintained footpaths and lengthy road repairs. Significantly, we heard of distinct difficulties and distresses related to infrastructure that completely disrupted people's opportunities for mobility and social participation. So I'm going to go into a case study now to compare two experiences of two older Māori women who wanted to gather harakeke in 2 suburbs, in Glen Innes and Mangere. And what this shows is how possibilities for experiences of joy, delight, and belonging are really determined quite definitively at a infrastructural level of urban planning, and by the infrastructural histories and trajectories of places. So there's a certain synergy between these two sites of Glen Innes and Mangere, which we're looking at. They're both historically lower income, working class suburbs, ethnically diverse, have long-standing Māori community presence and local maraes. Both also have quite different built histories. So that's a picture of Glen Innes in 1962. So by the late 50s, the suburb was developed for returning servicemen, and it was later further developed for Māori who were displaced from Orake in the city's attempt to clean up the slums in that area ahead of the Queen's visit in the 50s or 60s. Alongside housing, the development of the suburb included a town centre with a network of shops and amenities, as well as a marae and proximity to the moana. So the local marae in that area as well is very inclusive of different cultures, and participants who were connected to it expressed feeling a lot of support from this connection. Participants in this area also expressed a lot of appreciation for the shops and expressed a great care for and sense of connection to their local community, whether that was memories they've accumulated sort of planning marches and things at the McDonald's or at the pub. So these areas were steeped with history, and people had warm memories of gatherings and organising around these sites. So to be able to live in and move around these places that people had such attachment to inspired quite fond and nostalgic reflections, and suggested the potential for future connectivities in these places too. It's not like everything was rosy. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know about the rapid sort of and very contested infrastructural regeneration in Glen Innes. And so the constant building and reorganising of footpaths and roads and houses sees some people often living with the concern that they'll be displaced from their homes. And of course, that sort of building works affects people's mobility as well, because constructions take up footpaths. Yet the possibility for collective protest was evident in the energy surrounding this community, and the built environment seemed discernibly conducive to them gathering visibly to discuss their misgivings and express those in a way that they could be recognised. In Mangere, around the Te Puia marae, where we based our focus for the study, this is a suburb where building road infrastructure rather than suburban infrastructure has been prioritised. So this map here shows Mira Road in Mangere. So that's Mira Road. That was the site around there of Te Puia marae. And they had organised well in advance for Kaumātua flats to be sort of put around there. And the idea was that the Kaumātua flats would be connected.
Sorry.
The Kaumātua flats would be connected to the marae, so there could be an easy flow between those spaces. And then State Highway 20 was extended. And that's sort of a photo from Archives New Zealand showing the point where it's bisected, that connection between where the Kaumātua flats would be and the marae, right through there. So this was something that people in that community talk about, their elders having discussed and protested at the time, but didn't really go anywhere. So it severed that road, isolating the flats both from the Mangere township as well as from the marae that it was supposed to be an easy walk over to. So now the flats are only really accessible by vehicles turning in from the highway. And pedestrian routes out involve walking across a narrow path alongside the busy highway and taking a pedestrian bridge over it, which is a route that is both unpeopled and involves a concrete staircase that's quite steep, particularly if you're elderly, and it gives you a very daunting perspective of the motorway below. So almost all the participants in the site commented on losing access to places of cultural significance, as well as the unwanted exposure to pollution. And unlike participants in other sites who described enjoying trees and bush and natural scenes, certain foliage around this area in Mangere prompted emotional dissonance. At least 2 participants recalled that during the motorway's development, their elders requested that council landscapers plant native trees. and they quote, "They planted their own exotic trees, not the trees we would like planted. I remember our kaumātua at the time saying, no, don't plant those because we won't be able to see the moana. Well, it's happening now, you know, the trees are all overgrown, and it just cuts off that access for kaumātua to see the beautiful moana." So besides blocking a view, the trees are also a material and symbolic slight. They recreate access barriers because their low-hanging branches block the footpath, and they stand for histories of disrespect, of eroded rights and autonomy over the whenua, and of being unheard, slights that are all echoed through this site. Many of the participants associated with the flats and with the marae remain deeply invested and engaged in continuing the work of their ancestors who protested the motorway build. And I think that's part of what this collaboration comes from as well. But they have the ongoing feeling that their experiences were and might continue to be unseen and unheard by those who could possibly make a change. So you can see these sort of things, these long histories expressing in these very daily lived experiences of Whaia Grace in Glen Innes and Whaia Pania in Mangere as they discuss collecting puha, which is a perennial sow thistle, and harakeke, a weavable flax with medicinal properties on their walks. So we'll walk with Whaia Grace first. She's a Māori woman in her 50s. She has some difficulty walking, but she does walk a lot because she works at the local marae, and she goes there almost every day. So when we walked with her, she took the researcher interviewing her on one of her regular...
She's from Glen Innes.
Glen Innes, yeah. Did I say Glen Innes? Okay, cool. So she took the researcher walking with her on one of her regular sort of tracks to the marae and through her home, which goes through this lovely reserve. And she mentioned shortly after they were inside the reserve gates that there are sometimes puha, harakeke, and other forageable plants in the bush. She said, you can see them growing up along the sides. Round about this time of the season, I like coming down this way. A lot of the time with my eyes, I'm scanning around the edge of the harakeke because there's something in there that is so yummy. It's a good time when the rain comes up. The puha comes out, you see. You'll see a lot of them, so you know, a good menu will start popping up in your head on the way home. Buy some meat and then you pick it up on the way home. So there's a sense of a coherence and a deep, simple pleasure about the harmonies that she's describing here, of a movement between places that matter to her, home and the marae, and the satisfaction of other needs as she walks, a good meal that she begins to imagine and prepare for. She described moving from the fast pace of life in the reserve and how it slows you down, allowing you to appreciate a lot of things. She noted that one must be careful of where the Māori kai has been treated with chemicals and pesticides, and she says, in the eye of the council, it's about keeping it tidy without realizing what they're doing. However, the abundance of puha in her area in the reserve, sometimes growing wild on her property, reassured her, despite her concerns about the safety of the wild-growing puha and the different conceptions that council people have. The way her observations fit into her life overall is heartening. The ease and enjoyment that she describes here departs so strikingly and poignantly from the frustrations and difficulties that Whaia Pania talks about when she explains trying to harvest harakeke in Mangere. There's an absolute lack of personal traffic safety that drive home that this is an infrastructural problem for her. So she's a Māori woman in her early 70s. She lives at the Kaumātua Flats. And compounding her difficulties with mobility in general is that she finds walking around Mangere from her home especially harrowing because, as she says, the motorway is right there and the traffic is just ongoing. Right there. Mangere had not always been this way. She described a time when a part of the area that's now overtaken by, quote, houses, containers and factories was all trees that I could go and get my pine cones and my firewood and even my puha, much like Whaia Grace can in the present. So for her interview, Whaia Pania chose a route to the street nearby to show the researchers where she would like to cross to collect harakeke. Hardly anyone, so this is the pedestrian footbridge, and she didn't actually take us there on her walk because she finds it hard to get up there, but it's just so you have a view of it. But she says that hardly anyone in the flats uses that footbridge that would let them cross the motorway, because even though some people say, oh, it's only a little road, she says it's much more than that. She said getting to the bridge means that you hear it before you see it. It's the noise of the traffic up there on the bridge that made me think this is not safe. On the left-hand side, she narrated, is a big ditch and a dented barrier. Looking at the scene, she imagined how this happened. You can see the cars just come, trying to probably beat the lights, and gone straight into that ditch. Crossing under the bridge is a desolate area, and she worries for her personal safety. Yet it has just passed there, you can kind of see, and across the road, that the harakeke grows. And that's another factor, she says. How am I going to get my harakeke from there across the road back to here? I don't really like going out the back of people's houses now that they've been sort of cut off by the fences. I get this funny feeling I shouldn't be doing that. The only occasion that she'd had to actually collect harakeke from here was close to midnight when the traffic was much less. And on another occasion many years earlier, she tried to collect it from a more desolate spot, and she recalled dropping her bundle and running to her car when she noticed a man crouching suspiciously nearby. Since then, she's been mindful to frequent more crowded places. The scenes that she took the interviewer through in both in her memories and on her walk are full of danger, risk, and frustrated attempts to collect harakeke. They speak of an area severely fragmented by infrastructural decision-making that favours high-speed motor vehicle travel around which spaces for pedestrian mobility are barely usable, desolate, and dangerous. So before I pass over to Shanthi, this is just one sort of slice of the project, but I think it sort of demonstrates how transport infrastructure has a great capacity to bring people into and to withhold people from experiences of beauty, joy, and community. And by approaching wellbeing and the relationships between wellbeing and infrastructure from the ground up, we're hoping to link these community experiences to the upper level of transport professionals' decision-making and the experiences they have, trying to varying degrees and with varying success to make access equitable. So that's why we find ourselves positioned to sort of address the question of where state and transport sector responsibilities for mobility-related wellbeing lie by connecting these experiences. So we present these quashed capacities for fluid mobility, especially in the vicinity of Te Puia Marae and Mangere, as symptoms of infrastructural neglect. And our argument is that failing to address these is an abandonment by the transport sector of people in these neighbourhoods.
If you stay there, maybe just turn the thing for me. So just in closing, I think we were keen to present this to you because we really would appreciate your input on the process of how we engage with the transport sector. The whole idea here was not to describe some very poignant experiences here, but to actually, take a more emancipatory approach to changing the environment. These photographs were not taken by Whae Pania, but by others, but it really shows what Mangere around this Papakainga was really like. Crashed cars often there. This is actually some of the photographs when I was around. It's a very inhospitable area that would not, in fact, has made a lot of the Kaumatoa not even have their grandchildren visit them anymore because the children, their children who normally do the work in the marae, think it's not a safe place to bring their children. So the Mokopuna are not coming in as they used to do in the generations gone by. Just to the next slide. Just want to very quickly mention what the overarching findings so far from the project is, because there were other strands, as I mentioned. I think one thing that was really obvious from the way we were engaging was that there was a real importance in reaching communities on their terms in ways where we were not asking them, as happens with Auckland Transport, sometimes with consultations happening in a hotel in the CBD. These people are not going to be there. They're not going to be wishing to speak in that kind of forum either. So that importance of reaching communities is really important for us to understand. And they were very keen for transport professionals to come to them in their space and speak with them. They wanted, in a sense, not to shame, blame, and sort of leave them aside. They really wanted to work with them, including their local councils. The infrastructure, as I think Mythily has so powerfully and beautifully presented, powerfully impacts physical and social well-being, but manifests quite unequally across different communities, even between different low-income communities. And what we privilege for some, including myself, by being able to go really quickly from the CBD to Auckland Airport, thanks to State Highway 20, may have devastating consequences for others with a very far-reaching shadow. Our consultation processes that transport and other councils even use, and professional practices, producing, reproducing, and amplifying the kinds of inequities that we are seeing here. And the next one. And so we need to monitor the impacts of transport systems and act differently if we want a system, actually, as the Sustainable Development Goal says, that leave no one behind. So I just want to show you this slide. This is the transport outcomes framework that the New Zealand Ministry of Transport has. Right in the middle is a transport system that improves well-being and livability. And one of the key areas, their domains of interest are healthy and safe people, protecting people from transport-related injuries and harmful pollution, and making active travel an attractive option. Obviously, quite differentially implemented or experienced. I think that in closing, what I really want to say is that it's pretty obvious infrastructural reform is key to realizing the policy aims of that kind of agenda. But there's entrenched infrastructural injustices, cast a very long shadow, and the interactions with the transport infrastructure shape people's opportunities and choice and capability to live the lives they value. The challenge we have coming to this phase of our project, and it's interesting, I get asked to speak at many more engineering and transport conferences than I do to speak at health conferences right now, because they're aware of this work. But how do we cast that interest in a critical, so this is the right approach, place to speak about this, the critical approach to what's going on here, to inequities, without alienating the transport sector so much that they just kind of like, go away, you guys are speaking a different language, and there's that risk that we might totally disengage them. We have in our team a transport engineer who's actually amazing, Bridget Burdett. Some of you might have heard of her. She's incredibly invested in this kind of work. Actually, when you go to a transport conference, you see often the stage is taken by quite a lot of older men who basically kind of do all the keynote speeches. But quite a lot of the audience is now more women and more urban transport engineers and professionals. There's much more diversity, I think. But I would really appreciate, we would really appreciate, while we're in a sense going to this final dissemination phase, your thoughts on both retaining the integrity of the critical approach to what's going on here, which is effectively infrastructure violence, as some anthropologists would describe it. Dennis Rogers, I think, talks of it in that way, but not missing the opportunity to bring people along with us, because in the end, that's a challenge. So I know some of you have, Matheson, you've talked about this, I know at various presentations. We would really appreciate your thoughts and input on how we do that. It's a fine line. Actually, the communities want us to bring people with us. They actually don't see that they will get very much by just distancing these transport sector professionals, however misguided or ignorant they may be. So open to questions and comments and thoughts.